All right, let's open our Bibles. Genesis chapter 45. We're going to be looking at the story of Joseph, which is a very long story. So I'm going to summarize it in the message, but I'm going to read. We're going to kind of jump into it right almost at the end of the story, kind of the peak of the whole thing in Genesis chapter 45. So you find that. I'll give you just a moment. And then why don't we stand, and I'm going to read verses 1 to, let's go to, I think it's to verse 8. Genesis 45, 1, 8. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. All right, so we're doing the series that I'm calling Through the Storm. And again, the basic idea here is that storms come into our lives, difficult times come into our lives, and we wish that we could make these storms go away when they come into our lives. We wish we could kind of go around them, work our way out of them. We wish we could that they would just go away entirely, and yet what we discover, of course, in life is we usually can't wish them away. We can't go around them. We cannot avoid them. We simply must go through them. We have no other choice. And so this series is designed to help us do that. How do you go through the storms that come into your life? So today, I actually want to get almost as big picture as you can possibly get, literally on how does the universe work. But all of that is going to come down to the most practical stuff. So when you're going through one of the most difficult things you could ever face in life, what we're going to talk about today is what will give you hope and will sustain you and give you hope that the future could be different for you. Really, what we're talking about here in theological terms is what we call the doctrine of the providence of God. There's some big language for you. Throw that one around. Really what that means is the invisible hand of God and how God is working all things to his own ends. God is the one who is in control of all things, even though it's very mysterious to us and we don't even fully understand it. But it's this doctrine that if you can understand it as much as you can, will carry you through the storms. Critical stuff for us. And here's something I've learned also in my own life. This is something you need to learn before you get into a storm. Because there's so many questions that are going to come into your mind about this, you kind of have to have it basically worked out. Because if your life's falling apart and you're struggling emotionally and all that, it's hardly the time when you're going to be thinking through, "Oh, I wonder how this works. I wonder what the Bible says." It's going to be too difficult. This is one of those things you've got to lay the foundation now, maybe when you're not in a storm, because when the storms come, this is one of the key areas, one of the key things, the teachings, that is going to sustain you and get you through the storm. So, let me introduce it this way. I said we're going to talk really big picture, so let's think. How does the universe work? Well, some people say the universe runs on fate. Fate, of course, is a power that's greater than ourselves. It's some sort of force, and it determines the path of all things. It determines the path of your life. And so everything in your life is basically inevitable. You can't control it. It's going to happen. It's just fate. So when a storm comes into your life, if fate is what runs the universe, then the best that you can do is accept it. Fate has brought it. And you really don't have much hope except to hope that somehow fate is going to turn things in a different direction for you. But of course, fate is very cold. Fate is very impersonal. Fate doesn't really care, right? If you believe in fate, there's no comfort in fate. There's no kindness in fate. You just simply must accept your fate, if that's how you understand the universe to work. Well, other people say, no, there's no such thing as fate. There's just random chance. That's what the universe is. Again, this provides you with absolutely no comfort if you're in the middle of a storm. Because the answer to why are you there, you're just unlucky. You're born at the wrong time. This happened to you. Sorry it's happening. And the best that you can do is hang on and hope that very soon your luck changes. Still others would say, no, there are powers in this universe that are kind of like fate, but those powers somehow control and guide our lives. So for instance, here on the West Coast, despite saying we're this very scientific age and we only believe in what we can see and be proved, not true at all, because you just go down to Banyan Books, for instance, on 4th Avenue, go read the CBC News. CBC News will hardly ever run an article on what religious beliefs and groups hold. And yet, every single month what the CBC puts on the front of their news? Horoscopes. And what is a horoscope? A horoscope is the belief that the stars and the alignment of the stars not only control your life, but actually you should shape very specific decisions about when to apply for a job, when to pursue a romantic relationship, determined by exactly how the stars align. So somehow these stars are shaping your entire destiny. There's a power out there greater than yourselves. And then, of course, in the Western culture too, we have our tarot card readings, we have mediums, we have crystals that we put around our house, dream catchers, all of these types of things with the idea that there are powers that are greater than us, and if we can somehow tap into them, learn to work with them, they can guide us through the storms. But sometimes I just sit back and go, do we really believe, as the CBC would put on the very front of its news, that flaming balls of gas billions of miles away from us somehow shape and control not just our overall destinies, but exactly what job you should take? Interesting, for when you're going through a storm. Here's another one, very popular in Western culture right now, the law of attraction. You put out negative thoughts in the universe, you will attract negative things into your life. Put out positive things into the universe, you will attract positive things. There's a power out there that if you know how to kind of work with it, you can bring positive things into your life. So the difficulty, of course, with this is if a storm's come into your life, you brought it. You were negative in some of the way that you thought. You attracted this negative thing to your life. And now what you need to do is learn how to think differently. And somehow maybe you can attract something different into your life. So you have some control, but there's also things that are greater than yourselves going on here. But then finally, and probably the most common view in our culture, aside from all these, is for the belief simply is this. Life is up to you. You determine it. It's not stars, it's not fate, it's not chance. You control it. And of course, this is very empowering, especially when your life is kind of sailing through calm waters. You control your life. So believe in yourself. You can do anything you set your mind to. And of course, there's some great messages in there. Of course, we want to be able to encourage people to take ownership of their lives. But sometimes it goes even farther than that, this idea that you can do whatever you want to do. But I'll tell you, there are some storms that come into your life that are going to shatter that idea. There's some storms that can come into your life where you realize, I don't actually hardly have any control at all. When cancer comes into your life, when your child dies, when your life falls apart, you quickly realize, of course I have agency, of course I have some control and I need to be responsible. But there are some things that are just so great and powerful that I cannot control them. I simply am broken by them, and I don't know how to get through this. So, what is your view of how life works, how the universe works? Do you believe in fate, chance, horoscopes, the law of attraction, your own ability to shape your destiny? This is all super practical. I told you, it's very high level, isn't it? But it is so practical because when the storms come into your life, and as we said yesterday, they will surely come. Prepare for them now, or maybe you're in them now. Your belief about how the universe works is either going to make or break you. It's either going to give you comfort and sustain you, or you're going to be left out in the cold and falling into despair. So, this morning what I want to do is to approach this question by looking at one of the most famous stories in the Bible. Not just giving you like doctrinal point, here's what God does, but seeing it all worked out in a story. And of course the story is the story of Joseph. Here we discover in this story that the universe is ruled by one God. This God is a personal God, not a force. And even when the storms rage in our lives and we cannot see any reason for what's going on, the invisible hand of God is at work in mysterious ways that we do not often understand, working things out for the good, ultimate good of His people. That is hope. That is what will sustain you in the middle of a storm, when you've got nothing else and everything's falling apart. So we're going to develop that. There's going to be all kinds of questions coming up. So let's do this in three ways. First of all, I just want to experience the invisible hand of God through the story of Joseph. Then we're going to try and understand it as best we can. It is mysterious, but we're going to understand it as best we can because you're going to have a lot of questions that are going to come up in your mind as we talk about this. And then finally, and this is the main point, I want us to learn how to trust the invisible hand of God when we're going through a story. All right? You up for that? Your mind's okay? You waking up a bit? A little more coffee? Good? All right. Let's begin then by experiencing God's invisible hand through this story of Joseph. Joseph's life, like so many of ours, had some smooth sailing in it, great times, and then he had storm after storm after storm. So we don't have time to develop all of Joseph's story. So let me give you kind of the recap to build up to the passage that we are going to look at and that we read earlier on. Let's just start with his childhood. Joseph actually, from his view, I think, had a great childhood. Seemed pretty carefree, seemed to be going well. He was one of the youngest, second youngest of all of his brothers, so probably a little spoiled, like, the younger kids are. It's always the oldest ones, like me. We got to take the brunt of it, right? And then it's always the younger ones. They get the easy life. Any? Yeah, no, yeah. The oldest ones are shaking their heads. The younger ones are like, what are you doing? So, and typically, I mean, nothing's changed in his era too. Unfortunately, his parents showed favoritism in his family, and that favoritism was shown towards Joseph, and it made his brothers jealous of the way that his father, in particular, showed favoritism to Joseph. If you know the story, a terrible storm came into his life, and it was all triggered by one event when his father gave him this colorful coat. I don't even know what a modern equivalent of this, like, gave him like a really high-end Arc'teryx jacket. I don't know what it would be, but it was something very valuable, and it was clearly only given to Joseph and not to the rest of the brothers. And so all this family problems that were going on came to a head, and his brothers then came up with this conspiracy where they took Joseph out into the middle of nowhere. They threw him into a pit, totally blindsided him, threw him into a pit. Ironically, he's 17 years old at this time, exactly time. His birthday today, 17, and this is exactly when this happened to Joseph. His brothers grab him, throw him into a pit, then they come back, they take him out, and there happen to be some slave traders going by, and they sell him into slavery. He's taken to another country called Egypt. In modern terms, then, realize this, Joseph then became the victim of kidnapping, of human trafficking for the purpose of forced labor. That's what happened to Joseph. Now let's just pause here for a moment. How many of you, like Joseph, know what it means to have your whole life fall apart in 1 second? You never saw it coming, and all of a sudden, bam, like Joseph, your life takes a drastic turn. How many of you, like Joseph, know what it means to face injustice and betrayal, even at the hands of those who say they love you? These are storms that so many of us face. Difficult storms in life. Well, Joseph was taken to the country of Egypt. He was made a slave in the house of a rich man named Potiphar. 10 years he went by. He did not get to see his parents. He didn't get to see his family. They think he's dead. He's not free at all. Despite this, though, his life actually gets a little bit better in the house under Potiphar. He's put in charge of all kinds of things. But then another storm comes into his life. Potiphar's wife was not exactly an upstanding, integrous woman, and she starts hitting on Joseph and wants to have a secret affair with him. Joseph, though, is a man of integrity. He obeys God, and he absolutely refuses, despite Potiphar's wife's advances. And so she gets very angry that he won't do this, and so she falsely accuses him of sexual assault. And so when Potiphar hears of this, he believes his wife that Joseph is this terrible man, and he has Joseph thrown in prison. Joseph did the right and God-honoring thing. And because of that, his life got worse. So again, how many of you, like Joseph, how many of you had a storm come into your life? Because you obeyed the clear law of God, because you were obeying him, because you were living a life of integrity, and that went the other way around, and that life of integrity actually brought a storm into your life. Well, he goes into prison. I mean, he's just falling down here, isn't he? He's in prison, but even in prison, his life starts to get a little bit better, as much as it can in prison anyways. And he helps another prisoner earn his freedom, and that man promises to remember Joseph and to talk to Pharaoh about Joseph and get him out. So finally, Joseph's in prison, and he's probably thinking to himself, okay, this storm is almost over. He's 28 years old at this time. He'd think to himself, I've been betrayed by my brothers. I'm the victim of human trafficking. I've lived 10 years as a slave. I've been falsely accused of sexual assault. And I've been in prison. But finally, this 10, 11-year storm is almost over. I'm going to be free. This is great. He's got hope in his heart. And then a day passes. And then another day. And then a week. And then months. And 2 years pass. The man had forgotten all about Joseph. And Joseph just rots in prison. Finally, at the age of about 30, that man remembered Joseph. And through an incredible series of events, Joseph is set free. Not only that, as you know the story, he's made second in command in all of Egypt. Basically, he becomes an absolute monarch, an absolute king, second only to the Pharaoh. Pharaoh, Joseph, and given absolute power to rule. And he's specifically put in charge of a massive food storage and food distribution program in order to help save the country from famine that happens for 7 years. And now we're getting up to our part of the story. This is when the big moment happens. As he's going about his role really as a king, a group of middle-aged and older men show up, like many people are, into his throne room because they want to come to buy food because the famine is getting really bad. And so this is Joseph's whole life, is giving away food, talking to these kind of people. But he suddenly realizes that the men standing in front of him are his own brothers. Immediately, he's beginning to fall apart emotionally. He recognizes them as the one who betrayed him and really ruined his life. So what will Joseph do with all this power in his hands? Because of their actions. He's been trafficked. Because of their actions, he's not even seen his parents in over a decade. Because of their action, he's been falsely accused of sexual assault. He's been spent time in prison. And yet he's also been exalted to the second most powerful man in all Egypt. Here's what I think happened with Joseph, and what happens with us as well. Time has passed as he's been through these storms, and he's gained a little bit more perspective. He can't put together all the pieces of the puzzle, but he does start to see that there are some reasons for all this. And so what was amazing is he's not angry with his brothers. He's not cynical against God, despite going through this difficult storm. And we see his perspective in the moment when he reveals himself to his brothers. Imagine how shocked they were. I mean, how terrified to realize that this powerful man is the one that you betrayed. And now he holds your lives in the palm of his hand. And yet, listen to what Joseph says in verse 5 and 7 and 8. He says, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors, to keep your family growing. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." Now, we're going to say a lot more about this. We're going to go deep today into understanding theology and what the Bible teaches in a moment. But let's just kind of get a quick summary. It's pretty clear what he's saying. He's saying God is in control even when we can't see it. Right? He's saying God's invisible hand has always been at work, guiding and directing this entire process. Here is where we get hope in the storm. We'll summarize and we're going to have to develop this a lot. Whatever happens in the world, we are not the victims of blind fate. I'm so grateful for that. Rather, we are beloved characters in the story of God, our author. We are not living in an empty universe ruled by chance. I'm grateful for that as well. No, the universe is ruled by a loving and almighty God who directs and guides things as he sees fit. The universe does not work on an impersonal law of attraction where you attract negative or positive types of things. It's rather run by a personal God who cares about the details of our lives. We are not alone in the universe, so that everything happens to us by chance or by luck, and we create our own destinies. Rather, we live in a universe ruled by God who shapes our destinies with his wise and his caring hands. So no matter how dark the storm is in our lives, no matter how high the water is coming over the brink of our boat, how strong those winds may be, we are hidden in the palm of his hand. Listen to this quote. I think this almost captures this whole message today. You could summarize it all with this. A guy named James Stewart writes this: "There are no thorns so sharp that God's fingers cannot weave them into a crown of glory." The thorns are sharp, so we're using storms, he's using thorns. The thorns are so sharp. The storm can be so bad. But there are no thorns so sharp that God's fingers cannot weave them into a crown of glory. And what I'm trying to show to you today is that this understanding, this biblical understanding of the universe and of life that will sustain you, comfort you, and bring you joy and victory and peace when you're in the storm. Because listen, typically, though not always, the older you get, you begin to get some perspective. We never see it entirely, but you sometimes get more perspective. You ever look back at your life and you can kind of see, oh wow, that moment in my life changed everything. And what's pretty incredible is, just like I just quickly show you Joseph's story, those moments are often just seemingly normal and average events. This is what I call the quiet providence of God. So often God's providence is so quiet you don't even hear it. It's so in the background, and it so works through small things, not big things that we would usually think. We always look at the big things and wonder, oh, how is that going to happen? And somehow we don't even see it. Behind the scenes, small things are happening. So just like as a small kind of humorous example you'll see in a moment. One night in my first year of college, I was going to sleep, and a roommate, we had bunk beds, right? Just like kind of here, we're still sleeping on these bunk beds, man, all these years later. And my roommate, just out of the blue, says to me, you know what? I think we should switch colleges next year. I was kind of pondering on these things too, so we had this discussion, and basically that night we decided we're going to switch colleges. That single late night conversation set in motion a chain of events. I switched colleges. Switching colleges ends up for me volunteering at a church in Mission, where I'm doing music and things like that. At that church in Mission, there's a deacon, and the deacon's name is Stephen Pomeroy. Some of you might know that name. Stephen Pomeroy grew up in a church in Vancouver called Dunbar Heights Baptist Church. And now he's a deacon out in Mission. I get to know Stephen quite well. I don't even know anything about Dunbar at that point in time. Dunbar then starts looking for a pastor. Stephen tells Dunbar, as half his family's still there, the Anderson family, if you knew them, that, hey, there's this guy out here, I think he would be a great pastor. And so Dunbar calls me, and eventually, of course, I become the pastor of Dunbar. Becoming the pastor of Dunbar then leads me into certain relationships within a church in Victoria called Central Baptist Church. Eventually calls me after 13 years at Dunbar, and I moved to Victoria, which I know is terrible. I should have stayed at Dunbar the whole time. And then he wouldn't have got Wes, and I wouldn't be doing these fun things he does. So you got better in the end. So I go to Central Baptist Church in Victoria. Then again, through the series of events, that leads to Northwest Seminary and College saying, we'd like you to become the president here. And I just kind of look at all that, and all these events, they're links in a chain. And they're like domino effects, and some of them never would have happened had the first domino not fallen. So in some ways, and I'm kind of guessing a little bit at all this, it all goes back to a seemingly insignificant conversation at midnight in a dorm room with my first-year college roommate. You just go, wow, what? That's kind of crazy. I mean, can you look back at your life and kind of trace a little bit of, hey, this event leads to this event? Can you say with Joseph then about all those events, it was not you who sent me here, but God? It looks like all these things, but I can see there's an invisible hand somehow behind it all. We can't fully get it, but we can kind of trace some of God's hand. So that's just an experience of God's invisible hand, an experience of his providence in the story of Joseph. But if you're listening, and if you're thinking critically, I'm going to guess a lot of questions start to come up in your mind at this point, and they should. And if we don't answer these questions, we will not get the benefit of this great truth of the providence of God, and it will not enable you to go through the storm. You have to dig deeper onto what we're about to do right now, because these are the things that are going to be able to give you that hope and that strength when you're going through the storm. So let's take a few minutes now and do our best to understand God's invisible hand. Again, a lot of it we're not going to understand. There is tremendous mystery here, but I think there are some things that can be said. See, here's the problem with where our lack of understanding comes in. As soon as we say, God's invisible hand is the ultimate determiner of all things, like what Joseph is saying, it's not you who sent me here, it's God. God did all this, is basically what he's saying. Now a whole bunch of questions come up, and there's three, I think, really big ones. First of all, does that mean that God brings evil into our lives? Is that what Joseph is saying? Is that what we believe? And what about human actions and responsibilities? I mean, if God determines everything ultimately, then what are we? Are we just puppets? we just robots? Are people not accountable for their actions? Do our choices even mean anything at all? Those kind of questions are very important. We have to be able to answer them, because if we get these things wrong, we're going to have a wrong view of God, or we're going to become very passive and think, well, God's almost like fate, and I can't do anything anyways because God's in control. And we will also not get the courage and the strength that guys like Joseph had to get through the storm. So let's work through these. This is working through the doctrine. I'm going to make you think here, but if you can get all this in your mind, it will help you so much when the storm comes. As I've thought about this and taught about this over the years, here's the analogy I think I find most helpful whenever we're talking about this whole subject. I want you to think in your mind right now of juggling. Okay, so someone is juggling, let's just say they're juggling 3 balls. I can juggle, and actually I was thinking, man, to really drive this point home, I would have juggled 3 balls for this entire point. I'm not that good. I can only do it for like 15 seconds, and then it would just break the point. So we're not going to do that, but that's the analogy I want in your head, is somebody juggling 3 balls, all right? Now, if you take one of them out of the way, are you still juggling? You got 2? Well, sort of. We all know when someone's juggling 2 balls, you're like, meh, no big deal. Once you get to 3, you're like, oh, you know how to juggle. And then if they can do 4 or 5, you're like, wow, you're next level. What if they're just doing 1? Is that juggling? That's not juggling. That's just lame. Big deal. So you can throw a ball up and down. I want us to be thinking you have to have all 3 up in the air at the same time. So I think there are 3 categories, 3 truths that the Bible clearly teaches, and you have to juggle all 3 of these at once. You cannot let one fall. You cannot just juggle one, and this is where people get in a lot of trouble. They just want to hammer on one of these points all the time, and then they lose the other 2, and I would argue that's when you lose all the comfort you can get when you go through the storm. So here are the 3 that the Bible teaches. First, God ultimately decides what will come to pass. I should have put the word ultimately in there. God ultimately decides what comes to pass. That needs to be explained. Clearly, you'll see that in Joseph. Despite Joseph's brother's actions, despite Potiphar's wife, and what everyone else is saying, Joseph clearly states it is God who ultimately sent him here, doesn't he? God was not taken by surprise when the brothers threw Joseph into the pit. It's not like God was up like, oh no, I had this great plan for Joseph's life. Now the brothers have ruined it and thrown him in a pit and sent him off to Egypt. God's not surprised. Joseph is saying, in the ultimate sense, there's a lot of mystery so far, but he's saying in the ultimate sense, Joseph says, it was not you who sent me here. So it was not the brothers who sold him to the slave traders. What? Joseph? Of course it was the brothers. What do you mean by that? He's saying in the ultimate sense, in some mysterious way, God's invisible hand has been ultimately guiding this whole process. We're beginning with this one ball. That's all we're doing right now, okay? But this is a critical one in the Bible. Everywhere the Bible teaches that God rules history and he is working out his plan, that one event leads to another. So we can put it this way, that God's invisible hand is not just directing the destiny of nations, it's directing the smallest and most random details of your life. Just read through the Bible and look for this. You'll see really small things like moss growing, because God says the moss needs to grow. There's all kinds of tiny little insignificant things. And everywhere the Bible teaches that God reigns and he rules. And never underestimate the impact of small, seemingly inconsequential events. Like I said earlier with my little college room analogy, the smallest events sometimes have the most major consequences and create domino effects for major world events. Makes me think of an old folktale about a nail from a horseshoe. So a nail that you hammer in through a horseshoe into a horse's hoof. And this is how the folktale says it. For want of a nail, so for the loss of a nail, for the want of a nail, the horseshoe was lost. For want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For want of a horse, a rider was lost. For want of a rider, the battle was lost. For want of the battle, a kingdom was lost. All for the want of a nail. That's a kind of domino effect, the butterfly effect, to use another analogy. One nail falls out of a horse's horseshoe. That horse is lost, the rider's lost, the battle's lost, and the kingdom is lost. We see this same thing in Joseph's life. The one seemingly insignificant act of Joseph receiving this many-colored coat from his dad. This event sets off a chain of events which just follow it with me. If there's no many-colored coat, there's no conspiracy to kill Joseph. If there's no conspiracy, it means the brothers don't throw him into the pit. If there's no pit, then there's no selling him into slavery. If there's no selling him into slavery, then there's no Potiphar's house. If there's no Potiphar's house, there's no Potiphar's wife. No wife means not going to prison. No prison means he does not get exalted up to being the second most powerful man in the world. No, being second most powerful man in the world means he does not oversee a food distribution plan, which means Jacob and his 12 sons do not come down to Egypt. That remnant does not come down to Egypt, does not become the nation of Israel, does not get enslaved to Egypt. Therefore, they do not get redeemed from Egypt, which means there is no Mount Sinai. There is no covenant with God. There is no promised land, which means there is no Messiah, because the Messiah comes out of the nation of Israel. No Messiah means no cross, means no resurrection, means no second coming of Christ, means no heavens and earth. All because of a coat. Now you might say, God could have done it a different way. Of course he could have. But then it would have just been a different series of events. And what is clearly stated in this passage in verse 7 is that God sent him before you to preserve a remnant on earth. The remnant being the 12 sons of Jacob who become the nation of Israel, through whom the Messiah would come to bring salvation to the world. God's entire plan is dependent upon this group of people becoming a nation through which the Messiah one day will come. So it is very true to say, it's all because of a coat. Seemingly small, insignificant events can have massive consequences. So this is the first ball that you want to get deep into your heart, and you want to let settle deep in your heart, that God is sovereign over all things. We cannot somehow miss this point and start somewhere else. But we must begin with there is only one power in the universe, and that is God himself, who is the ultimate power. Very mysterious to us, yes. How his invisible hand does all this? Very mysterious. But this is where we begin, with God, who God is, and his ultimate sovereign power. But having said that, you cannot just throw one ball up in the air. Because if you do that, now you have a major, major problem. And that problem comes to do with, what about all the evil in the world? Are you saying God causes all this evil? You got to throw a second ball in the air. And here is that ball. It is this truth, that God is not the author of evil. God is not the author of evil. Did God throw Joseph in the pit? No, God didn't throw Joseph in the pit. Joseph says it right here. You guys are the one who sold me into slavery. You guys are the ones who did that. They are morally responsible for their actions. God did not throw Joseph into the pit. And yet, at the exact same time, Joseph is going to say, it was not you who sent me here, but God. You see what he's doing? Two balls are in the air now. Two balls are being juggled, and you have to keep both of them up at the same time, lest you somehow think God was incompetent. He could never stop this. You know, God, all things are out of control. You can't have that. No, God is sovereignly in control. And yet you also must not make God the author of evil on the other hand. You have to juggle both. Everywhere the Bible teaches that God is light and in him there is no darkness at all. God is never the author of evil. You got two going. That's great. Here's the third truth. Again, equipping you. We're going to get to this. Is equipping you so when you come to the storm, you'll be ready. Here's the third one. We are not puppets. Our actions matter, and we are held morally responsible for them. Notice that Joseph does not say we're all just puppets and God made all this happen. Look at verse 16. This is very clear. Sorry, not verse 16. Verse 5. In verse 5, he says, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. Who sold him? The brothers sold him, right? But then, comma, still same sentence, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Here we're juggling. And you see how Joseph can do that all in one sentence? This is what you and I have to be able to do as we think about the whole way the universe works, how God works, how storms come into our lives, what God is doing in our lives. We have to juggle all these. The brothers are morally responsible for their actions, and in the same way, our actions and our choices matter, and we are morally responsible for them. So we have to juggle all these things, because you don't want to say everything comes down to human free will and human actions. If you say that, what's God even involved in? I mean, most things in your lives are the result of your choices or someone else's choices. So if God can't work anywhere where human choice is involved, he can't really work anywhere, except for out in a desert somewhere with some bugs or something. Right? So you can't say it's just only God, our responsibility and will, and yet you also don't want to say God causes evil, and you don't want to think we're just puppets. The story of Joseph shows us to juggle all three of these truths. Hold them all up. God is ultimately sovereign. God is not the author of evil, and our actions and our choices matter. So, that's the story of Joseph. To help us to really, really get this, and probably make it even more clear, let's just say everything I just said, but with a totally different story that I think should really make this point clear to you. If you're not even convinced of what I'm saying yet, hopefully this will convince you. Let's put our thinking caps on for a moment. Here's the question. Be careful how quickly you answer. Who put Jesus on the cross? I worded that very carefully. Who put Jesus on the cross? I don't think it's an overstatement to say, if you can answer that question, you understand everything we're talking about, and you're going to be equipped to know how to live your life, and more importantly, you'll know how to deal with the storms. If you can answer that. So let's work it through. Was it Judas who put Jesus on the cross? You can answer now. I'm not trying to trick you. Was it Judas? Yeah, absolutely it was Judas. Judas is the one who betrayed him. Judas is the one who sold him. Jesus himself holds Judas morally responsible. So the answer is, so far, Judas. Yes, Judas is responsible. How about the crowds? Were the crowds in some way responsible for putting Jesus on the cross? Definitely. They're the ones who called for his crucifixion. How about the devil himself? Yeah, it was the devil who entered Judas. It was the devil who was there. Somehow there's some dark powers at work behind all of this. Seems like it's out of control from one perspective. So yeah, we could say the devil put Jesus on the cross. How about Pilate? Did Pilate put Jesus on the cross? Most certainly. He's the one who had the ultimate authority in this moment. He's the one who washed his hands, and he handed it all over, so legally this is done. It was a kind of a mock trial, and it was all unjust, but Pilate is responsible. How about the soldiers? Did the soldiers put Jesus on the cross? Of course they did. It wasn't God who put the nails through Jesus' wrists. The soldiers drove the nails through his wrists and through his feet. God did not do that. So, who put Jesus on the cross? I said I worded it carefully because I didn't ask the question, though. Who murdered Jesus? If I asked you the question, who murdered Jesus, the answer would stop about right here. But I didn't ask that question. I said, who put Jesus on the cross? Put is a little bit more of a morally neutral term, isn't it? The Bible declares that though it's all true of everything we said, we're juggling a few balls now, ultimately it was the invisible hand of God that led all events to Jesus being crucified. Listen to Acts chapter 2, verse 23, where Peter says this to the people of Jerusalem. He says, this Jesus was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Do you see how once again we have a sentence where he's juggling all the truths at once? There's not just one thing here. There's no breath. On the one hand, who put Jesus on the cross? Clearly in this verse, he was delivered up according to the plan of God, which if you read other verses say that God made this plan for his Son to be slain for our salvation before he created the world. So God has had this plan in mind from before creation, and he has led all events to ensure that his Son is given over for our salvation. And yet without even in English we have a comma, who actually murdered Jesus? Who was morally responsible? Speaking to the crowds, you crucified and killed him by the hands of lawless men. See the juggling going on? Acts 4:27 says the exact same thing. The disciples are praying, and here's what they pray. They say, in this city that were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, there's your list of people, But notice this, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. Wow. So, these people are all morally responsible, and yet in some other mysterious way, this is all according to the predestined plan of God from before the creation of the world itself. So you see, we must uphold all three truths. God is sovereign over all events. God somehow does this, though, in a way he is never the author of evil and should never be accused of it. And human beings are not puppets. Our actions matter, and we're morally responsible for them. See, we get off track when we emphasize just one of these truths, and we just try to juggle one ball at the same time. But Joseph had come to see in his life, and we must come to see, that even when it seems that evil is dominating the game of life, God is still master of the situation. So we can say with Joseph, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Okay, so that was a lot of thinking for 9:30 or whatever time it is on a Saturday morning. But if you stayed with me, that's the core teaching. Now let's get really practical. Let's come finally to bring it together and talk about trusting God's invisible hand. Because this is what we need in the storms. Joseph got through his storms, and Jesus got through his storms because they saw the mighty hand, invisible hand of God behind their lives and guiding their lives. This was the secret to Jesus' hardest hours. This is when he's coming before the Father in Gethsemane. He's asking if there's any other way, but he is submitting to the plan of God, to the invisible hand of God leading all these events. This is what sustains Jesus, that his Father loves him, that his Father cares, and his Father will accomplish his purposes. When everything was falling apart, he knew he could trust his Father. This is the key to getting through the storms of your life as well. Your life is not happening all by chance. Got to remember that. You got to remember, it's not the stars and the planets that are somehow shaping your destiny. I mean, Christians, quite frankly, should never read horoscopes. It's really kind of, honestly, it's a silly, ridiculous thing to somehow think that I should choose my job based upon the alignment of flaming balls of gas billions of miles away. That's to trust in stars, not to trust in your Creator. And also, we should got to realize that we are not controlled by powers greater than God. This is a key point. Maybe you can just make sure you understand this. There is only one power in the universe, ultimately. It's not God versus Satan as if a black dog is fighting a white dog and we're not quite sure who's going to win. There is only one God. And Satan, though a great and powerful being far greater than us, is nothing more than a pawn on God's chessboard. There is only one God who ultimately reigns and rules. Our life is not dictated either by an impersonal force like fate. It is in the loving hands of a God who is intimately involved in the life of his creation. So we got to stand in awe of this. This is where we find our strength. That the Almighty God who created the universe, this God who created all these galaxies, this is the God with all this power. He is the one who is guiding and leading even the smallest details of our lives, though much of it is mysterious to us. But here's the more important thing. Even if you get everything that we talked about today rock solid in your heart, okay, God is ultimately sovereign. It might be mysterious. That could still feel cold, because how do you know that this great and powerful God is for you and not against you? When you're in a storm, this is where your heart goes. God, this storm, this circumstance, it feels like you're not for me. It feels like you're against me. And that could be terrifying news, that the supreme being of the universe is controlling things and he's not for you. That's scary, actually. So you need to combine the providence of God with the love of God. And here's where you need to go, a verse you probably should memorize or be very familiar with. It's Romans 8:32. It says that the God who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, will he not graciously along with us give us all things? Here's the logic of that verse. God did the hardest, most impossible, self-sacrificial thing that could ever be done in the history of the universe. He did not spare his Son. He loves his Son. Listen to this. He loves his Son far more than he loves you. He's his own beloved Son. There is nothing more precious to God the Father in the universe than his own beloved Son. And the logic of that verse is, he gave up his Son. He did not spare his Son in order to win you. So if he will do the hardest thing for you, if he will give up what is most precious to himself for you, you can be absolutely sure that if he's done that hardest thing, he can come through on the smaller things. He's done the hardest. He'll do the easier things like providing for your finances, giving you a job, and carrying you through this life. He did not spare his own son. He loved you so much that he gave up his son's life. His son voluntarily gave it up for you. So when you combine the power of the invisible hand of God with the loving heart of God and put these together, now when you are in a storm, you can rest. You don't have to freak out and be afraid that, oh, luck has come down upon me. I have no hope here. You know, one of my favorite novels and stories is The Count of Monte Cristo. Anybody know that story? At the end of the book, anyways, not in the older movie, there's this tremendous line, or the author Alexander Dumas, he says, until the day that God finally reveals all things to mankind and makes all things right, he says all human wisdom is contained in these two words. And it's these two words that will get you through the storm. Wait and hope. Wait and hope. And if you've got all the things that we talked about here today in your heart and in your mind, when that storm comes, it's going to feel like maybe God's lost control of the universe. It might feel like God is against you. But when you bring all these things into your heart, you say, he is not against me. He's proven his love for me in his son already. I do not understand this. And what I will do right now is I will wait and I will hope. And hope will not disappoint us. For like Joseph, we might feel abandoned for a season. But we take courage in his story. We take courage in the story of Christ. The invisible hand of God has not done its work yet. Remember we said yesterday, we must walk the footsteps of Christ. And what is the footsteps of Christ? First the cross, then the crown. And if that hope is in this life not fully understood, one day a day is coming when he will not only just get rid of all storms in our life, he will break you on the little ship of your life. You will break out of the darkness, and your little ship will land on the sandy shores of eternity. And when you get off that boat, and Jesus takes your hand, and you look at him for the first time, and you see him for the first time. When you look out into the stretches of whatever that future glory is, and then you turn around and take a look back at the storm you just came out of, you will think to yourself, why did I ever not trust him? Look at all that is before me. He has brought me safely to the shore. And then you will look back at that storm and all the events of your life and all the things that have happened. And you will say to them all, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Let's pray. Father, your ways are most of the time very mysterious to us. But we want to rest in these truths that we've learned, that you are the ultimate determiner of all things. You are the sovereign God, and there is none beside you. We do not understand how you work these things out with evil, with injustice, with betrayal, with all the horrible things that happen in this world. And yet you have proven your character, proven that you are a God of love and a God who will ultimately come through on your promises. You've shown it in giving us your Son. So, Father, though we do not understand the vast majority of things that come into our lives, the storms, we do not understand them. We wait on you. We hope in you. And we look for you to finally fulfill the promises that you've made to us. So I pray for whoever's today, maybe at this very moment in the middle of a major storm, maybe losing hope and faith in you, that you would restore that hope. You'd help us to see the bigger picture. Help us to see that you are not done with our lives yet, and there is an eternity of glory awaiting us. Sustain each one of us. Give us strength to continue on through the storm. It's in Jesus' name.